Wanted to say, first off, thank you very much to everybody that's joined us this evening. Everybody that shared questions ahead of time. We really appreciate you being here. My name is Taz Lagu. I'm with the Chapel Hill Planning Department. I'm joined by my colleague, Anya Gran-Federmack. I really couldn't underscore how excited we are to be here this evening. We've got already about 50 attendees, which is a record for these neighborhood meetings. And I know we have many more planning to join us this evening. Because of how many folks we have on the call, we're using this webinar format. So you'll see us, and I apologize that you can't see or talk to each other on the Zoom call at the moment. Once we open things up for questions, you'll be able to use the raise hand feature. And we'll be able to bring you in so you can share questions or concerns with the group, and Anya and I will do our level best to address those. The goal this evening is really for us to hear from you. We want to hear your questions and your concerns about this Housing Choices proposal. I think it's very important to remember that this is very much still a work in progress. And so your questions and your concerns are very meaningful to us, and we hope to be able to keep improving this proposal to address some of the issues that you bring up this evening. We're going to get started with just a quick presentation from Anya, and then we hope to spend the majority of our hour and a half together this evening working through any questions or concerns that you all might have. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Anya.
All right, is everybody able to see the full screen?
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Taz. So again, we're going to go through this fairly quickly. A lot of this information is on the project webpage, on the public input page, and maybe even in our frequently asked questions. And we'll make sure to share the links to those in the chat during this meeting. And so really quickly, this is where we are. So you may have heard that I guess it was a couple weeks ago, we asked that the council close the public hearing. And we did this to give staff an opportunity to hold more community open houses and neighborhood meetings such as this, because we really want to make sure that we get plenty of feedback from all of you. This schedule is available on our project webpage, and we'll continue to update that project webpage to show upcoming meetings. But I did want to point out that on March 27th, we're going to have another public open house over at the Seymour Center from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. And then we are hoping to go to a work session with the town council on April 10th. And we're hoping that during that work session, we have the opportunity to share with council some of the feedback that we've heard from all these different neighborhood groups and at our open houses and our community meetings, and then to have council give us some direction on how to best move forward. So we get asked a lot about why are we doing this? Well, in September 2021, several council members petitioned the staff to create a pathway for missing middle housing. There was interest in addressing the housing demand that the community is seeing while we await the Land Use Management Ordinance, or LUMO, rewrite project. And so that's what Taz and I have been working on. And so from out of that request, and along with a bunch of other projects that the council had sort of initiated, came this projected housing needs study. And there's a link to that on the project or the public input site. And basically what it found was that our housing supply has grown, but we're not meeting current demands. We're very good at building single family houses, and we're very good at building apartment buildings, but we haven't built much in between. And so that study found that we need about 500 new units per year just to meet the current demands. And there's been another study that I'll talk about in a second here, but the projected housing needs study found that of those 500 units, about 40 were needed, I think, for student housing, and the remainder were for households and workforce housing, divorced parents, single parents, retirees, empty nesters, and so forth. So then after that, as part of our transit-oriented development, or TOD project, we actually had another study done by SB Friedman. And so as part of that project, they found that there's really only a small percentage of people that both live and work in Chapel Hill. And so the income required to afford the median home value exceeds the median household income. And even if you want to rent an apartment in Chapel Hill, anything built over 2011 is probably going to require an annual income of about $69,000 per year. So building on this, the complete community strategy also calls for a diversity of housing types and recognizes that new units and accessory apartments can be added to our existing neighborhoods to add gentle density. So the proposed text amendment really takes on two parts. The first part is that we recognize that there's a need to update some of the current provisions in that land use management ordinance, or the LUMO. And we want to make sure that we're providing a clear parameter for townhouse developments, because that's not currently addressed in the code. The second part, which is why you're all here tonight, is really focused on increasing these opportunities for missing middle housing. And for us, missing middle includes things like triplexes, fourplexes, and cottage courts. We want to remove some of the density limitations, and we'll talk about that in a second. And we want to create an admin or administrative approval process for the triplexes and fourplexes that would mimic that seen by single family development. So here's kind of the definitions that we're using. When I know there's a lot of interest in like this missing income housing, but from a zoning perspective, when we talk about missing middle housing, we are really talking about those types of buildings or housing types that fall between the spectrum of a large apartment complex and single family development. And so those include duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes. This definition calls it a bungalow court. We're calling it a cottage court, and other like small scale residential multifamily development. And then for us, gentle densification is really the process of increasing density slowly within existing neighborhoods by allowing some of these missing middle housing types. So again, the purpose of the text amendment is really to clean up the LUMO, to create some opportunities to integrate missing middle housing forms into the existing residential neighborhoods. We want to increase housing production by identifying some of the barriers that have prevented the development of accessory apartments, duplexes, and other small scale multifamily projects. We also want to encourage compatible infill development, both in established single family neighborhoods as well as the local historic districts. And then we want to identify ways that we can strategically and sensitively increase density through that incremental development. So when we talk about eliminating density maximums, we're really looking at a column that's in the land use management ordinance. Currently, the town measures density by the number of units per acre, and we think that there's other ways and better ways to regulate density. Density can still be controlled by if we focus on the lot size, the setbacks, and even the building dimensions. And so you can see from this diagram how you can take the same mass of a house, and maybe it's a single family. You could divide it into two to create a duplex. You could divide it vertically and horizontally to create a fourplex, and so on. And so even though the size of it doesn't change, you're increasing the number of units and the density. And so this is the table that we had presented to the town council back in January, and you can see across the top here are the different residential zoning districts. Along the left column are the different use categories. And so where they're underlined, like this cottage or fourplex, those are proposed new uses. On the table where there's a P, that means it's a permitted use. And where the P is underlined, that means that it's proposed to be a permitted use. So I'm just going to fly through some of these examples. The first one is the townhouses. And so again, these would generally be one connected or attached house per lot. We've included some setback requirements as far as like following the underlying zoning for the larger lot. We provide some parking standards and so forth based on the feedback that we've heard from the Community Design Commission and the Town Council. The other type of new development that we're proposing to the LUMO is this cottage on a compact lot. And so we had talked to some of the planners in Durham, and they found that there was still a lot of demand for detached single family houses when they went through their expanded housing choices text amendments. And so what we've come up with is this cottage on a compact lot. So if you had a parent lot, you could create one smaller lot The minimum lot size would be 2,700 square feet. Because that lot size is reduced, you would also have reduced setbacks. We'd also require that you have a shorter height, and then your maximum footprint or your floor area would also be smaller to reflect that smaller lot size. Triplexes are already identified in the LUMO, but fourplexes are not, and so we wanted to incorporate fourplexes as a proposed use. And so we're just trying to make sure that it fits in. We want to make sure that it looks similar or the same as a single family house. And so we're proposing that the minimum lot size, the setbacks, some of those dimensional standards are the same as single family. We've proposed an impervious surface of 0.5, which matches single family. Currently, multifamily is allowed, I think, 0.75% of the lot or 75% of the lot can be impervious surface, but we wanted to scale it down so that there's less pavement. We'd also proposed a tree canopy coverage of 20%. And then currently, single family does not have a parking requirement. However, we recognize the importance of parking these units. And so we want to follow the same standards that are in the LUMO for multifamily. And so the number of parking spaces required is determined based on the number of bedrooms. We've also limited the unit sizes, and we want to come up with some neighborhood compatibility standards. And so these probably are not the best images to use because they're from a set of historic district design standards. But you can see how in the image above, if one of these three is new construction, it fits within the character of that district or of that neighborhood, where the example below is out of scale, the windows don't match, it's very jarring. And so we've proposed some neighborhood compatibility standards where if a neighborhood has been platted for at least 20 years and it contains at least 50% of the lots are single family, we would require then that you measure a circumference of 150 feet around the property and do sort of a neighborhood compatibility study, looking at the setbacks, making sure that the height of the building is not more than 10 feet taller than the adjacent buildings, trying to match the roof form, the building width, even the orientation of the entrances to be similar to the adjacent neighbors. We also include some regulations about fenestration patterns, so the windows and doors, and the building materials. And we know that when it's a single family neighborhood, you typically don't see parking in the front yard. And so we want to make sure that any new parking is proposed on the side or at the back of the lot. Then this last one would be these cottage courts. And so this is a combination of 3 to 12 units. They're in these smaller cottages. And you can see from the building dimensions that we've also tried to really minimize the size of those cottages to keep them small. And we also recognize that this graphic is not very reflective of the standards that we're proposing for Chapel Hill, because again, we want an impervious surface of 0.5. We want 30% tree canopy coverage. And again, we want to limit the number of parking spaces to about 1 to 2 vehicle spaces, depending on which zoning district you're in, per dwelling unit. And so I think in the questions that you submitted, you had asked a little bit about what does this look like in R2? And while we didn't do a study specific to your neighborhood, we have been kind of looking at different neighborhoods, seeing what the massing and the forms of the buildings are and how we can build upon this. And so you can see what our urban designer here has come up with. This is sort of some standard lots that we found in R2. The buildings are generally, 1 to 2 stories in height. There's sometimes an attached garage. Usually they're oriented towards the street. And so in this first scenario, he looked at where we could add like an accessory apartment, which is currently allowed under the zoning code. And so you can see in these red diagrams how it could be a detached building, maybe in the backyard. In number 3 here, it's a unit within the house that you can access from a side door. Maybe you're converting an existing garage, or maybe you're building a new garage and putting that accessory apartment above it. We also looked at how it could fit, how missing middle housing forms could fit in. And so if this number 1 is your typical single family house, maybe number 3 becomes a duplex where they're stacked one on top of each other. In number 5, he's showing a fourplex. So each one of these units, or each one of these is a unit. And in 6, he's showing a triplex. And in these examples, we're showing that, again, the parking is pushed towards the back of the building. So that that was a little bit of a preview. We've also gone through your questions and we've identified some common themes. And so we wanted to address those and then get to your specific questions. So let me quickly kick it over to Taz.
Cool. Thanks, Anya. So I think one of the very common categories of questions that we got were related to infrastructure, right? How will the town's infrastructure deal with an increase in density? I think one of the top concerns for folks, especially given the context of your neighborhood, was stormwater, flooding, things of that sort. One of the key features of what we're proposing with the Housing Choices proposal is that any of these new, smaller, missing middle housing types would actually be required to conform to the town's stormwater regulations, which is something that currently single family development isn't subject to. So if a triplex or a fourplex were to be built, it in some cases would be required to include stormwater control measures that minimize any runoff off of the site. At the very least, they would have to understand what their stormwater impacts would be and wouldn't be able to essentially make anything worse than it was prior to that construction. And so we really believe that that's going to be a strong control on any negative impacts related to stormwater. Another kind of common concern that we've heard is around utilities, right? If we add more houses to a neighborhood, how would things like electricity, how would water and sewer be able to keep up? I think when we look at major utilities, we've discussed with OWASA, for example, what the system-wide impacts of kind of gradual increases in density would be on the system as a whole. And there really isn't any concern about whether the systems as a whole could adapt or accommodate the relatively minor increases in density that we would be expecting. Duke Power, OWASA, they're all planning based on regional growth and very long timescales. And so relative to what they're already planning for, we're expecting very small increases. But that doesn't mean that on a very local level, right, on a street or at a neighborhood, that there might be some concerns. And that's why our utilities like OWASA are part of the development review process. And so if there is a concern, right, that the water main on a particular street isn't new enough or robust enough to handle some new development, our utilities would be able to prevent any new development that would stress the local infrastructure or the local utilities to a point that wouldn't be acceptable. Another concern that we've heard is around solid waste, right? How will a triplex next door, what's that going to look like in terms of trash bins out in the street or something of that sort? Which is, again, where some of the specific and unique design standards relevant to multifamily would kick in. Unlike single family development in Chapel Hill, if you build multifamily, you're required to account for waste management, right? You're required to create screened off areas where roll carts or other items related to your waste management would be screened from neighbors. And so again, we think that that's another design standard that we hope will mitigate any impacts that some of these newer missing middle housing types might have on neighbors. And then we've heard from a lot of folks, both from your neighborhood and from around town, about how these increases in density would impact things like traffic, transit service, and traffic calming. Again, we have talked with our transportation planners, and we're fairly confident that, again, based on the relatively small increases in density that these missing middle housing types might create, that there aren't going to be system-wide impacts on traffic in any sort of negative way. I know there was one question regarding transit service to your neighborhood in particular. we have seen, right, that transit needs a certain amount of density in order to justify running services to parts of town. And so what there is a potential for is that as more density makes its way into certain neighborhoods, we could justify, right, additional transit services to parts of town that may currently be underserved. There's also a great question regarding Vision Zero, right, and how the town would be able to accommodate for greater density in neighborhoods and make sure that adding density doesn't impact the safe neighborhood feel that y'all have become accustomed to. As part of Vision Zero, the town is working on developing a neighborhood slow zones program. It is very much still a work in progress, but there is absolutely room for, as that program gets built out, for it to think about and accommodate missing middle housing types, right? And to potentially, we certainly can't promise that there would be a prioritization based on missing middle, but it certainly is something that could be a possibility, right? That neighborhoods that are seeing more density could also be high on the list to be included in neighborhood slow zones.
Okay, and so another question that we've heard both from all of you as well as other neighborhoods is about trees. And we understand how valued they are by the community. And so I just wanted to point out that because of state laws, municipalities are very limited in our ability to require tree protection. And so what we do is that the town's urban forester really works closely with developers to identify specimen trees and provide guidance on how to limit impacts to their those critical root zones during construction. We often, and actually always, require that developers to actually identify the trees on their plans that they plan to remove and which ones they're planning on saving. And then prior to the start of construction, the construction team or the development team will actually sit down and have a pre-construction conference with our urban forester to review procedures for protecting those trees and managing any other landscape elements that they've identified on their plans to preserve and maintain. And so while we can't require developers to actually preserve all the trees, we can require that they provide a minimum tree canopy coverage based on the gross land area. And so you can see in this table, we've identified the existing and proposed uses. And so currently, like single family does not, even though most of you have lots of trees on your yard, we actually can't require you to have any tree canopy on your property. And so what we can do is we can require that developers of triplexes and fourplexes and even cottage courts and other missing middle housing types, that they provide a minimum tree canopy coverage. This might include existing trees, or it might include that they add new trees, or maybe it's a combination of the two. And again, this is where our urban forester really comes in handy, because he works with developers to ensure that the trees are planted and that they're going to survive before we issue them a certificate of occupancy at the end of construction. Let me kick it back to Taz.
Thanks, Anya. So another set of questions has been kind of around, well, what can this missing middle housing proposal do to address affordability in town? And unfortunately, this is something where we as a local government really have in some significant ways have our hands tied by state law. There are certain things we unfortunately cannot do, right? And those include regulating ownership, right? Who lives in or who develops or redevelops a property. We're not allowed, kind of related to that, we're not allowed to require owner occupancy. So for example, we could not allow or require that if you were to build a fourplex, that the owner of the fourplex has to live in one of those units. That's unfortunately just something that we're not allowed to do by state law. We're also not allowed to have any sort of explicit rent controls to set a particular rental rate. One of the things that we do as a town, though, is have an inclusionary zoning ordinance. In this case, our IZ ordinance, as we call it, kicks in for sale units where you have a development of 5 or more units. So for the missing middle housing types, that would be the most relevant for our cottage court type. And in that case, if you had 5 or more units, our IZ ordinance would require that 15% of those, whether that's an actual unit or a payment into the town's inclusionary zoning or affordable housing fund, that there's a contribution of 15% towards supporting affordable housing. And so just to reiterate, we are very much in the middle of work on this proposal. We're hoping to, continue to engage with the community and continue to use that engagement to make this a better and more responsive proposal. Hoping that later this year, we'll go back to council for some updates and to get, additional guidance as to what sort of direction they'd like to move in. So with that, I think we're ready to open the floor to questions. This is very much why we're here. I just want to note a couple of things as we move into the question and answer section of the meeting. We have, at most recent count, we have 77 attendees, which again, we're incredibly excited about, but it does mean that we need to be mindful of each other's time. We're going to have a 3-minute time limit we would ask folks to stick to for your questions or your concerns. There'll be a little timer on screen that you'll be able to see in a quiet reminder once you hit your 3-minute mark. So you can go ahead and use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll bring in 1 or 2 people at a time, just so you know when you're on deck. And we'd ask that once we bring you in, you unmute yourself, share your questions or just general comments on the proposal. And Anya and I will do our best to answer it if we can.
So thanks, Taz. With that, I'm going to move in Linda and then Andy.
Is it because of the questions I asked earlier or with the text, or?
No, I'm just going in order that I see people raising their hand.
Okay. I just still don't understand. Are you two from this area? Have you lived in this area? Can you tell me a little quickly something about yourself?
Sure. I don't know that it's a prerequisite to be from the area, to be a responsible planner in the area. I myself grew up in Chapel Hill, lived in and around the area for about 23 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I can just say I'm not from the area, but I've worked in Chapel Hill now for over 4 years.
Okay. I was just curious, because most of us have lived here 40 years, or more, I don't really have any other questions. I have a yard that I have sculpted over the years with walkways and trees and flowers, and I have no desire to bring that to demolition. I will tell you that right away. It's hard work. It's not anything I did with money, and I think a lot of us feel the same way about our homes. And we are a very friendly neighborhood. I've known people since I moved here 40 years ago in a different house that we still get together with the woman's, it's like an annual meeting of people who used to live on Landerwood Lane. It's like, it's a neighborhood. It has a neighborhood feel. And I don't think many of us want to give that up. Does that make sense? Yeah. We watch out for one another's children. We just do a lot of things that are kind to one another, and we like that aspect. And I don't like the aspect, and my son lives in one of those complexes that you're talking about. He doesn't know his neighbors. He doesn't, I'm very anti that kind of, and I'll be honest about it. That's the part that the giving away of the humanism of it of living bothers me. Okay. And that's all I have to say, really.
Thank you. All right, Andy is up, and in the meantime, I'm gonna move in Ghislaine, and I apologize if I mispronounced that.
Am I up? Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask 3 quick questions. If you guys want to make notes of my questions and then answer them, and do like that real quick. One of the things I've been concerned about, by the way, I'm a lifetime resident of Chapel Hill. I've been here since 1966 when my family moved here. And I've always worked in the greater area. Is one of my concerns is that as a community, we have not done things to bring in higher paying jobs so that people can generate incomes to be able to afford some of the neighborhoods we've talked about here, versus creating this greater density. And so I think that's something that I have not heard in the meeting. I went downtown, and then in this meeting, I think that's a very important question to address either now or in the future. Number 2, I know this in our neighborhood, but what about the Umstead Park, Barclay Road, 7th Street flow neighborhood? And there, that's a much older neighborhood. And is that part of this planning aspect? And then lastly, when we talk about building new units, the building cost versus rent cost, and that to making these, I don't like the word affordable, but cost effective, whatever you want to do, say there, duplex, triplex, fourplex, that the construction cost doesn't vary that much. So there's still going to be higher end rents, just like the apartments are in Chapel Hill, the $1,200 to $2,000 a month rent, which is a house payment, similar to a house payment. So that ties back to new jobs where people can afford to purchase a home versus renting. Sorry about that. Thank you. And I would just say that these questions should be included in future conversations, not just in Colony Woods, but these other neighborhoods too.
Thank you.
Hi there. I'm Guylaine, but I go by Peggy. Everyone knows me as Peggy. And I understand what Linda's talking about. And I don't think it's the size of the house. I think the issue is that when you have smaller units, smaller surface area for a living unit, they tend to be transitional. So that the biggest change to a neighborhood is when people see it as a stepping stone to the next house. Whether they're owners or renters or whatever it is, they're going to move on, because that's kind of the vision that we have in America. Whether that's realistic or not, I don't know. But that's what changes. And we see houses in our neighborhood that have become rental homes, and the people live there for a year or two and they move on. So they don't watch their kids grow up there, and they don't form neighborhood friendships. One thing I wanted to ask about the impervious surface, looking at those designs, even though you say it's not going to change, it's still going to be 0.5, I think you said, but there's no way on the diagrams, once you have the little garages in the back and the parking area, could it be mandated by the town to have those driveways and parking areas, not covered structures, but where you drive, not be impervious? Could they be gravel, or could they be concrete blocks that have those designs? Open network concrete blocks that still let the water drain through and up, so that maybe some prohibition to paving and asphalting. And my last little point, I see I have a minute left, is on canopy. If you could define canopy to me it's trees that create shade over a certain amount of space on the lot. But would somebody taking out those trees and replacing them with 10-foot high trees, would that be considered canopy? That's the end of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move in Robert Nielsen and then Jennifer.
And Peggy, I just wanted to briefly touch on 2 of those questions. One is just about the impervious surface. The diagrams that we've shared take into account some of the various site constraints that these proposals would impose on a site, but they aren't meant to take into account all of them. So I think impervious surface, for example, was not necessarily factored into those diagrams. But when a developer or a homeowner looks to build, they would very much have to account for all the requirements on the, that are part of this proposal. And then to your point about the tree canopy, we do have specific rules for what counts as a canopy tree. A crepe myrtle, for example, is not a sufficient replacement to an oak. We do understand that when you're planting new trees, we do have to accommodate the fact that younger trees need some time to grow, and so we do expect that there would be some transition time between a home, being built and getting a full canopy.
Hey, this is Robert. You haven't talked about, and this particular concept confuses me, why HOAs and covenants are involved in this. I mean, it seems like the town would have jurisdiction over its area, and if there's a homeowners association within that area, fine, but or how covenants, I think covenants might actually be between the owners of the property and the town itself. So could you explain the legality of those?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Robert. Covenants, especially restrictive covenants that might be related to an HOA, are actually they're private agreements between homeowners. The town isn't a party to those, and so basically the way it would work in a neighborhood that has restrictive covenants. Let's say somebody wanted to build a triplex, but their covenants didn't allow that. The town, when we issue permits, cannot and does not take into account restrictive covenants, right? We issue our permits based on what's in the town's ordinance. So if you're in a neighborhood with a restrictive covenant, the town might issue you a permit to build something, but if your restrictive covenants prevent it, you would have to be ready for your neighbors to sue you, is basically the way that kind of enforcement mechanism would work, but it's not something that the town is at all involved in.
Thanks, I'm done.
Thank you.
Thanks. And when I move you back into the attendees list and you've said what you needed to say, if you don't mind just lowering your hand, that'll help me keep track of who's spoken. And I'm just going to keep going in order, and we can get through the question and answer, even the chat. We'll have those for our records, and we can save those for the end. So Jennifer, you're up, and I'm going to move Bill and Ann in.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So just several questions I have. What neighborhoods are currently being looked at? That's one question I have. Second question is, what benefits do they have for the actual homeowners in the area? Chapel Hill's pretty expensive tax-wise. I don't know if the neighborhoods will get any kind of tax breaks or anything like that for having multi-family units in there. And the third question I have is, what timeline, you might have mentioned a little bit of this, but what timeline do you have for this, and how much community input will we have on what goes on with this planning for Chapel Hill? Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. So just really quickly, we're not looking at this in a neighborhood by neighborhood context. We're not trying to pick and choose neighborhoods where this will be implemented. We're really looking at the town as a whole. In terms of tax breaks, that's unfortunately just not something that the town is able to do, to provide tax breaks on a basis of that sort. And again, it's something that's very much a limitation from state law. In terms of the timeline and engagement, we first went to council several months ago, and we've been holding a lot of meetings just like this, meeting with neighborhoods that have expressed concern about the proposal basically since January. and we have basically a very full dance card of similar meetings through April. We haven't mapped out exactly what our engagement will look like beyond that, but we expect that we're going to be continuing some pretty robust engagement. We're checking in with council in mid-April, and then potentially going back to them to begin kind of a public hearing process in May. But again, that's not a firm timeline. We really want to make sure that engagement and kind of thorough analysis and consideration about the proposals is what's driving the timeline, not any specific goals in terms of getting to council by a certain date or anything of that sort.
And I would
I
just,
guess
oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
go ahead.
Well, I was
I
gonna
just
say,
have concern. You go on and then I'll say my last thing. Go ahead.
okay, sorry about that. I was just gonna
Okay.
say, we're thankful that all of you registered for this webinar because now we have your email addresses. And so we'll make sure to notify you of any upcoming meeting dates or community open houses and so forth, so that you're included in the conversation.
Yeah, that's appreciated. I just have real concerns about this town council really having input from the community. I feel like that they have not really they say they want community input, but when it comes down to actually using that community input is a different factor on things. So I have real concerns about, is it something that's really just something to appease the community, or are they actually going to use input from the community to make decisions about the future of Chapel Hill and what the people who live here?
I think that's really helpful. Thank you, Jennifer.
Any response to that?
I mean, we can share the public comment. We'll probably be providing a summary of it when we go to that work session. I mean, we've got these recordings where we've got the public input page where folks are welcome to provide comments. You can also email mayor and town council. And so there's lots of ways to provide it, and it's up to the council with what they do with it.
Is there a way that we can have that input be stressed, that we want as much community input as possible from people who live in this area?
You broke up here and there, but I think you want to stress to the council that they need to provide as much, or they need to provide opportunities for as much public input from residents as possible. Is that correct?
That is correct. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so Bill and Ann, you are next.
Yes, you talk about gradual growth. How do you make sure it's gradual rather than everybody wants to develop it? Is there going to be a maximum number of units you're going to see developed per year? That's first question. Second question, density. Can everybody in my block do this, or are you going to have separation? If you have separation and two neighbors want to do the same development, same type of development, how do you choose between the two neighbors who are going to do development? Third, what are the consequences if someone doesn't obey the restrictions? For instance, tree canopy. Suppose they built the apartments and then cut down all the trees. What if they have a certain number of cars they're allowed to park there, and yet other people, they park more cars there? How do you deal with those? Or what are the consequences going to be significant enough to stop people from doing that type of behavior?
Never mind.
Okay, those are my questions.
Thanks for those questions, Bill. Just going through, I think your first and second question are very much linked, right? So in terms of the gradual nature of how this is likely to play out, we've seen in other communities that have passed missing middle housing reforms that it has been gradual growth or gradual densification. There's a lot of, I think, systemic or institutional factors that impact what sort of, for example, financing a developer could get for something like a triplex, right? They don't have access to the same sorts of investment that somebody that's building large multifamily would. And so it's much more likely that this is going to be a slow process. But we don't want to just rely on likelihood, right? And so we have heard from a lot of folks that they are interested in guardrails, right, that are going to help ensure that this remains a slow and gradual process. And so we, like I said, this is very much a work in progress. Some of the things that we are thinking about would be guardrails like a annual limit on the number of new triplexes or fourplexes that could be built. As you mentioned, I think we talked about this at a town hall, at an open house that you joined. One of the things that we're thinking about are separation requirements between new triplexes and fourplexes. Generally speaking, those could be structured as, we don't want two triplexes next to each other. You could say that you can't have them within a certain distance of each other. Usually when regulations of that sort are implemented, it really is a first come, first serve question. There's really no attempt by the town, or there would be no attempt at the town to pick between competing applications if they would conflict based on those types of requirements. And then your last question about enforcement, that's something that we're working really hard to understand. We have code enforcement staff with the town that work as diligently as they can to enforce the town's parking requirements and other code related requirements. We certainly expect that will need to be a very significant aspect of any of this new attempts to bring density to the town. And so we definitely expect that we will stay in close coordination with our code enforcement staff to make sure that it's not having negative impacts on neighbors.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to move in Diane Willis and Sandra next.
Okay, I'm Diane Willis. Given that our state laws prohibit controlling to whom you sell your property, and given that our state laws prohibit any kind of rent control, what is to prevent housing corporations, or really anyone with the resources, from buying up housing like ours in our neighborhood and building all these duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and then charging exorbitant sales prices or rents? That's one question. And then the other one is council people at the January 25th council meeting stated plainly that this plan of the towns is not to create affordable housing, but to create more housing. I'm guessing that they subscribe to the notion that greater supply will reduce the demand and therefore reduce costs. But in housing markets, this does not apply. There is an infinite demand that cannot be satisfied with enough housing, at least in our lifetimes. Can you respond to this concern, please? That's my other question.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. So to your first question, you're right. We cannot control who buys or who builds missing middle housing. It's tied to this notion that, again, when we're looking at missing middle housing, we are not expressly trying to create affordable housing or lower income housing. We are truly just trying to create more housing, which speaks to your second question, right? As I think you identified, one of the biggest challenges in housing that it is impossible to build enough housing to reduce prices. I think a goal of adding more housing is to, at the very least, slow the rate of increase in housing prices, which we know is just exorbitant in Chapel Hill. And so anything we can do to kind of bend that curve is going to be beneficial for the town in the long run.
But have you seen that happening in the last 10 years here? Have you seen any prices coming down?
Again, part of the issue is that we have not been keeping up with the very extreme demand for housing. The town is moving in a direction that we hope will start to address that. And, you know, it will be, it remains to be seen exactly what the price impacts are. But again, I think it's really important to underscore that lowering prices is not the primary goal of this proposal. The primary goal is to create more housing that speaks to a broader range of needs within the town.
But how can it when it won't be affordable?
Yeah, so affordability, again, is one measure of the type of diversity in needs. But there's also just diversity in needs in terms of the form of housing, right? We currently have a lot of very dense multifamily and a lot of a very nice lower density single family. But there's a whole swath of housing types in the middle, the missing middle, if you will, that's not really part of Chapel Hill's housing stock, or at least Chapel Hill's new housing stock. And so that's what we're looking to promote with this proposal.
But underneath all of this, I've gotten comments from both council people and the ideas behind yours in the planning department, that they think this is going to create more affordable housing.
Yeah, and again, Diane, that we're gonna have to move on, but that's a possibility, but it's by no means something that we're hanging our hat on in terms of the justification for this proposal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is it my turn now? This is Sandra. Hi.
It is. Hi, Sandra.
Hi, I'm a resident here in Colony Woods, and I just wanted to say that I'm really excited to see this come forward. I would love to see increased density in the neighborhood, and I would love to welcome more people to the community that we do have, that some of your earlier commenters were talking about. It is great to know your neighbors, and I think it'd be great to have more neighbors, particularly when we're thinking and talking about things like aging in place. Like, I would love to have a space where my mom can live behind my house, and where other folks, graduate students, young professionals, etc., can come through. So I was wondering if maybe you could tell me a little bit more about the forms of development that you're thinking about. You mentioned the bungalow court or a cottage court, and some of those, if I understand correctly, have some shared communal space, right? Where perhaps there would be some space to build some of that community that we were talking about earlier. And I was hoping that you could tell me a little bit more about those types of developments.
So for the sake of time, Sandra and everybody else, I'm gonna make sure to include some links in the chat so that you have it. And I think you'll find more information about cottage courts and some of the resources that we have. And I would also,
cool.
Oh, sorry.
I think they're great, and I just wanted to hear more about it, but that's okay. Thank you.
No, that's okay. I wanted to make sure that we're respectful of everybody else's time, and that's why I want to make sure that you get the resources you're looking for. So with that, if Sandra, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So with that, I'm going to move Todd and Bruce in, and we will just keep moving down the line. Okay, Todd, can you hear us?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, this is Christy, Todd's wife. It was actually I who hit the little icon. First of all, I want to thank both of you. I know that especially, I can't speak for other neighborhoods, but certainly this neighborhood has a lot of opinionated people. And I applaud you for your intestinal fortitude in coming and joining us this evening, even though we were told it would be only an hour-long meeting and not an hour and a half. So I have comments. I want to underscore what my neighbors Jennifer Daniels and Bill and Ann Brashear said. First of all, I don't trust this city council, except for Adam Searing, to tell me that which direction is north. I have absolutely no doubt that the fix is in. We are going to have this. This is going to pass. that has already been decided, and they're just going to go ahead and bulldoze it through because that's what they do. If they had a backbone, they would work instead on modifying or repealing form-based code here in Blue Hill, so that we did not have a surfeit of those very expensive apartments and condos that you describe on Elliott Road, already existing, which are not completely full, along 15501, not completely full, and soon to come, having bulldozed down some affordable housing along Ephesus Church Road and where the new Elliott Road will be. But they're not willing to do that. And I think that that is an example of bad faith. I'm also feeling that this is an example of bait and switch, because you say that we need 500 new units a year, and at the same time you tell us that this will be gentle, that this will go slowly. I don't see how those two things can coexist. And yeah, that's it. And please underscore what Jennifer Daniels said, and please underscore the excellent questions that Bill Brashear said. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. And I just wanted to briefly touch on one point there. The notion that, this proposal is incompatible with the town's broader goals of reaching this development kind of goal of 500 units per year. This is very much one part of a broader strategy to meet the town's housing needs. We do not by any means suggest or propose that this missing middle housing is going to be what gets us to 500 units per year. We hope that it adds some diversity in the types of new housing that gets built in Chapel Hill, but we're not looking to this or this alone to hit that 500 unit per year mark.
So what would you expect to see in a year from this proposal?
Yeah, it's hard to say for certain, but other communities that have passed similar proposals have seen, kind of a slow uptick of a handful of new missing middle units per year, and so I think we could see something similar. So again, not trying to use this as a major part of hitting 500 units per year, just something to add, again, gentle density and diversity to the housing stock.
So you need 500 and you say a handful. That's a handful 5 or a dozen or 50.
Yeah, again, it varies based on the
other neighborhoods have done this. What have they seen?
As I mentioned, we've looked at some other communities, other towns that have passed missing middle housing reforms, and they've seen, depending on the community you're looking at, maybe 4 or 5 new triplexes or quadplexes. Durham has seen a lot of small houses on small lots, and so again, we can expect similar results, but we can't say for certain.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to do Bruce, and then I will move in the next person. The next one is Jonathan after Bruce. Oh, Bruce, are you still with us? Let's give Bruce a minute. Jonathan, do you want to go first and then we'll come back to Bruce?
Sure. I want to second the comments about unhappiness with the way the town council, except for Adam Searing, has been handling all these development questions the last 4 or 5 years. We've seen a gigantic number of apartments being built every place. And now we're talking about changing neighborhoods that have been stable, calm neighborhoods for a long time. And I'm sorry to say that it does look like this is a done deal and something we're stuck with. One of the questions I'd want to ask is, to what extent of the town's hands will be tied when a developer wants to take a property and build some multiplex. Will there be an opportunity for neighbors to talk to the town, as happens, for instance, when someone goes before the Board of Adjustments to replace, for instance, a deck in the floodplain? All the neighbors are informed, and people have a chance to bring to the attention of the Board of Adjustments or whoever is appropriate some particular concerns that the town might not be aware of. For instance, flooding. The town clearly is unaware of flooding in certain parts of town, and if a builder wants to build there, it might be necessary for neighbors to be informed and at least bring to the attention of the town the need to look carefully into whether or not it's appropriate to build there. This would also be true if there are already existing multiplexes with lots of students living there, far more than the developer claims to be limited to. So will there be an opportunity for input like this?
Thanks, Jonathan, for those questions. We're not currently proposing an opportunity for that sort of input. But it, like I said, this is very much a work in progress and certainly something that we could consider as we continue to refine this proposal. So we really appreciate your comments and thoughts on that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Bruce, are you back with us?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I was muted and then unmuted and then muted again. I have one, if I may, one observation, one opinion, and then two questions. The first observation is I am intensely opposed to this upzoning for all the reasons that I'm sure you've heard many, many times from other people who've written in and have spoken here. I just hope that you don't go back to the town council and say, well, you know, the neighborhoods had some concerns, but no one was really intensely upset. We are intensely upset to the point that we've even enlisted some legal support to help us understand what we might do if indeed the town rams this thing through on us. Okay, I'm sorry. Now let me proceed with the questions. The first question, looking at my house, it's on 1/3 of an acre, like most of the houses in this neighborhood are. I cannot possibly envision putting a duplex or, well, triplex or a quadplex or a cottage court on 1/3 of an acre and have it at all fit in with the rest of the neighborhood. So I would really like to see that addressed. The second thing is, will there be any, design review of these, things that are proposed by developers to make sure none of them are going too far left field? I mean, are you, as part of your current activities, working on, standards for the lots in terms of setbacks on, the north, the south, the front, the back, and the size of the structure, the amount of how close to the property line they can get? And that's the questions.
Thanks, Bruce. And I will say that currently planning staff does look at things like setbacks and building heights when we review either single family development or in those cases where we're looking at multifamily before it goes to a planning commission or council, that we do have to go through the LUMO and make sure that it's meeting all the development standards. And so if we have neighborhood compatibility standards, those would be something else that staff would have to review under the current proposal. It could be that, as we go through this, council might say, no, those belong at an advisory board, and then it would be up to that advisory board to review it.
Where are you developing those standards, those LUMO standards out in
Yes.
terms of setback and so forth. Because it's going to have to be very different than what it currently is for my neighborhood. I mean, you can't be 80 feet back from the curb and build a quad. Certainly not a quad with 4 units of apartments that would be suitable starter houses for 4 young couples.
And I think that's one of those places where we can regulate neighborhood compatibility, but it's really going to be up to the developer to determine how many units and the required parking that they can fit into a lot based on those standards. And so, like you said, if you don't meet the standards, or maybe it was brought up before, then you may need a variance from the Board of Adjustment, and that's a separate process.
Yeah, the developers tend to stretch these things as it is. And unless it's pretty clear cut, who knows what we're going to wind up with here.
We understand your concerns.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so let's keep moving. I'm just going to ask if you've already spoken, put your hand down because that'll help me keep track of who hasn't. So I'm going to move on to Kathy and then KH.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Okay, first of all, I'd like to say that I, among others, am intensely upset about this, deeply perturbed, and I have very little faith in the town council and the mayor, polite and friendly though she may seem to be. My first question is, or my first comment is, when you're talking about cars allowed per dwelling, and you're talking about a quadruplex, let's say that there's 4, obviously there will be 4. What if each person or each family has 2 cars? Can the town in any way limit the cars that these people are allowed to have? The answer is no. And therefore, what will happen? There could be 8 cars on a lot the size of mine. I mean, it's just crazy. That's number 2. Number 2 is this. Something about having a walkable community was mentioned. Well, we don't have that in Colony Woods. And what concerns me enormously is my sudden suspicion that there may in fact be plans for more building to go on of restaurants and shops close to us. I'm not sure if I like that. In fact, I'm quite sure I don't. But even if they're not, that doesn't mean that this will ever be a walkable community. It won't be. And I like it that way. And I think my last feeling is that, once you say, and you just did, unfortunately, we don't have any control over what the builder finally decides to do. That means you're opening this neighborhood to whatever the builders decide to do. And I think that that is actually just criminal, really, on the part of the town council and the mayor. There is no respect for what we have here already, which is a very nice, modest neighborhood. And I, for one, would like to keep it that way. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Could I piggyback? I'm her husband.
You've got a minute. Hurry up. Get going.
You know how this goes. All right. So just in terms of the way the community could change, we're talking about impervious surface and canopy coverage and what the limitations will be. I believe that because the houses are small, relatively small on their lots and are on relatively wooded lots, that even using the requirements for impervious surface and canopy coverage that you're talking about, that will in fact be much greater impervious surface and much less canopy coverage than we currently have. That's just a comment. That's all I got.
Thank you both.
Mhm.
We're going to move on to David and Philippe. Give me just 1 second to move you over.
You did great.
Okay, so David Adams and then Philippe.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, I can't hear you.
Oh,
Sorry, yes, we
hear you,
can. I
David.
was
Yep.
muted.
I have clarification questions around your regulations and their enforcement. Question number 1 on the enforcement comes from a situation that's happened in Durham where a developer put in a bunch of these complexes next to a single family unit and dumped all the stormwater on that person's lot. And the town, the only way any correction could be made after the fact was to sue the developer. And Durham said that the individual had to be responsible for suing the developer, not the town. So the question is, on enforcement, will the town be liable to go to court to sue to get things done? Question number two, you do a lot to develop these regulations, but I, like a lot of people who've already spoken, I do not trust this council whatsoever. And I could see that after this was approved, a certain period of time later, the developers are not making enough money. So they go back and say, we need to loosen these restrictions. And lo and behold, now that the camel's nose is under the tent, they can go back and loosen the restrictions all the way till what we get is Blue Hill form-based code again. So I want to know how long these regulations are going to last. And then finally, which hasn't been brought up, but we have 5,000 units of housing units are already approved and in the process, 5,000. So we don't have the housing crisis that I think is being made out. We have a crisis for developers who need to make money. And related to that is the problem is not necessarily the town's problem, it is the university's problem. The university has the buildable land, the university has the housing needs. So I don't understand why the universities and a supposed housing crisis is being put upon a neighborhood that has been stable since I've been here for over 30 years. Thank you.
Leap.
Yes, so I certainly appreciate this comment from my.
I apologize. I meant to mute myself and accidentally muted you.
No, that's fine. Yeah, so I certainly appreciate those comments, and I want to thank the gentleman who just spoke. I'm with him 100%. I do not trust any of those town councils, and I cannot wait for next election, to be honest with you. But when it comes to this neighborhood here, I want to join the legal effort to oppose the town council on that. So Bruce, I would love to get in touch with you on that. I came from Europe where, this little social experiment that you're trying to do here, we've done it back in the 90s and early 2000s. That has failed. Okay, and that's exactly where you're going here. You're gonna price out some of our folks in the neighborhood who have been living here for 40+ years, and we're gonna end up having frat houses because there is no regulation from the town on that. And I just personally, you've got developments all over town. I mean, if you go from north to south or east to west, you're gonna see dozens of new communities coming in. Just in the neighborhood here alone, I can count at least 5 projects undergoing right now. This is outrageous. How do you talk about a housing crisis when you've got 10,000 apartments coming in? This is crazy to me. Leave those single family houses neighborhoods alone, right? Because truthfully, you're not gonna supply the demand there, by adding 3 or 4 families a neighborhood a year. That's not gonna solve your issue, right? You've got to extend the boundaries of the city and extend your public transportation to meet the needs. That's what you've got to do. 6 years ago, we were talking about it at the Chamber of Commerce, but at that time, somehow that was not a priority, right? Now that we elected, some lobbies from the town council to work on affordable housing and all, it just became a #1 priority for the town. Why don't you try to focus first with the people who actually pay property taxes here locally before you actually try to rent out some of the properties and the houses? Think about us first, please. We are paying taxes to pay your positions right now. That makes me upset.
Thanks very much, Philippe, for those comments.
So with that, I'm going to do a quick time check. We have about 15 minutes left. We're going to move in Eleanor and Charles.
Mute.
Hi, this is Eleanor. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I have several questions. I reviewed the Flumo update, and on the last page, you had this, you put up a map of all the zonings areas in Chapel Hill, but you didn't provide an updated map, you know, saying this R1 zone is now going to become R4. You didn't indicate in the map the regions, you know, the neighborhoods that would be upzoned, okay? So that we could tell, you know, everyone can be informed, you know, every neighborhood that's going to be affected will be well informed. The second thing is, I think I second what other speakers have said, that you cannot, you know, use, what we are afraid is you're going to pass a new land use management ordinance and say, these are the rules. And like in the Blue Hill District, you'll say, okay, you agree to the rules. And as long as you agree to the rules, that's fine. But there's no enforcement of the rules. So if I come and, you know, I won't be notified that my next, you know, the lot next to me is going to build a triplex, and they're not going to, you know, are you going to tell, are you going to inform me that they're going to build a triplex? And what is the recourse of saying they're not following the rules? You have no enforcement. You're not offering any enforcement. It's not like, you know, if you're going to build a whole new development, you will inform all the neighboring communities that they are being, you're not going to be doing this. What if they say, I follow the rules, but you have no way of enforcing them? Then the other thing I wanted to ask about the cottage courts. Are you going to put it, I have a 1/3 acre lot. Are you going to put that cottage court in the 1/3 of an acre? Okay, or are you talking about, oh, it has to be at least 2 lots? I mean, what is reasonable for you? If you're going to put a duplex or triplex in what is a single house, of course, you're going to have to provide parking for them. And so you will have to impinge on the backyard and make that all concrete to provide enough housing off the street. So those are my 3 questions.
Let me take a few seconds. I'm Mark, Eleanor's husband. A lot of this seems to be motivated by studies showing a need for 500 new units a year. And I'm wondering, where are those studies? Are those published studies? Are they posted on the town website? How good are the studies is basically what I'm asking. Let me just go through. And the second is, you know, I mean, I can see you guys are working really hard on this, and you're very well motivated and so on. But I'm wondering if the town council feels that it has received a mandate from the citizens to do this, to go through this major upheaval of neighborhoods. Because in the 2021 elections, there was no whisper of all of these changes that were in the offing. And I'm wondering, wouldn't it make sense for the citizens to get a chance to vote on whether to move forward with this? And finally, you said correctly, I'm sure, that we have no way of controlling who buys a lot and decides to build a quadruplex on it. But, and that's true, but by saying that people can build quadruplexes, you're appealing to developers, because most ordinary citizens don't want to build a quadruplex on their lot. And those are my questions or comments, whatever they are. Thanks for listening.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so Charles, you are next.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good, thank you. So this seems to be where we are. You all have told us that increasing missing middle housing is really not going to increase affordability of housing. And Taz has assured us that any changes will be slow, so the number of units that we will get, at least in the short term, will be few. Meanwhile, some of the council members, and sadly, some of our neighbors, are suggesting that opponents here, and you're hearing mostly opponents, are racist in our views. Now, it seems for that to be the case, you need to be talking about increasing affordable units, and you're not talking about increasing affordable units. So if we're not going to improve affordability and we're not going to get much extra housing, but we're pitting neighbors against each other and sending potentially affected neighborhoods to lawyers to assess their vulnerabilities, is the juice worth the squeeze here? I mean, do you in planning ever decide that maybe something is not a good idea? Are you empowered? Are you able to go to council and say, rethink this? It's not a good idea, in my humble opinion. Thank you. You don't have to answer that, by the way. I know that's an awkward kind of thing to say, but but if you do feel that power, that if you are actually empowered to do that, that'd be nice to hear.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for those comments, Charles. And we're not going forward with this because we're compelled to. And as I've mentioned many times, this is very much still a work in progress. We do want to make sure that we are improving the proposal as best as we can based on the feedback that we're receiving. I do think it's important to note that controversial doesn't mean bad, right? We are certainly trying to move forward in as responsive and responsible of a way as possible.
Well, I will say this. When I heard that people thought opposing this was racist, I thought back to, 60 years of being on the right side of that issue, and it really pissed me off. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. I'm going to do my best to try to get through everybody who still has their hands raised. If you've been following along in the chat, we will make sure to get you guys an email before the end of the day on Friday with a YouTube link for this recording, as well as links to some of the pages that I shared in the chat, because I recognize not everybody's able to open those links. So first we're going to hear from Dimitri and then Ari.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So I have only been living here for a few years, but when I saw this neighborhood, I fell in love with it. It is cohesive. It has a very friendly, safe feel, and it doesn't seem to be missing any middle housing from this neighborhood. And just like myself, when I was looking for a place to live, I saw what was here and fell in love with it and invested a large amount of my savings into buying a home here. And as has everyone else who has purchased a house here, they saw what they liked and they bought into it. So it seems like there should be a higher bar to coming into something that's existing and works and is liked and people spent a lot of their worth becoming part of, to not change that without from under them, basically. And with that in mind, I'm curious why only the neighborhoods without HOAs seem to be, if I understand it correctly, and maybe if not, please clarify. Why is it that only the neighborhoods without HOAs are being targeted? I would like to understand that, and then I'll ask the second part of my question.
Thanks, Dimitri. I will just briefly touch on the HOA question. I think we've got to keep moving, just given the number of folks. HOA neighborhoods are not exempt per se. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the call, or earlier in the call, the town doesn't take into account restrictive covenants or anything of that sort when it issues permits for new development. It's just a matter of, you could get a permit, but then be subject to be sued by your neighbor if you're subject to a restrictive covenant. So in terms of the town's perspective, the restrictive covenants are an entirely separate pressure or requirement that is privately enforced, not enforced by the town.
I appreciate it. So quick follow-up question. It sounds like then there are no limits. All current single family neighborhoods are potentially subject to this. And it sounds like rather than introducing missing middle housing, this will ultimately serve to eliminate exclusively single family home neighborhoods from Chapel Hill. Is that, am I understanding that correctly? That's the reasonable likely outcome if a developer can jump in and pay more and put up a triplex, that eventually all neighborhoods will be affected? And if that's the case, then why should living and raising a family in a single home neighborhood not be a choice for Chapel Hill residents? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question to answer, Dimitri. I think we do not expect that this is going to sweep across the town and drastically alter the character of neighborhoods. That's kind of part and parcel of the missing middle housing equation, that it can genuinely fit into the existing character of neighborhoods without massive disruption. And we're doing our best to tailor these proposals in a way that would limit any of those negative impacts.
We got about 3 or 4 minutes left. I'm going to try to get through everybody who's got their hands left, if you're okay that we go over by just a few minutes. And so Ari, you're up. I'm also going to move in Mark Edwards.
Hi. Hi. Dimitri asked most of my questions, but I'm just going to rephrase the HOA question. Just simply on numbers, how many neighborhoods are affected by this versus not, just in sheer numbers? I mean, you have to have that. That's been asked multiple times since this was proposed. Do you? That's all I want to know. Everything else is Dimitri pretty much covered. I moved here a few years ago, all the same stuff.
Yeah, it's really hard to say with any high level of certainty, Ari. We have, we can generally estimate that neighborhoods that were built after the 50s or 60s are likely to have restrictive covenants, but the level of detail and ultimately of legal work that's best done by practicing attorneys or title companies that's required to say definitively whether a neighborhood has restrictive covenants that would prevent missing middle housing is something that we're just not capable of doing at a town staff level.
But even as a gauge, who pays HOA fees and who doesn't. You can just look on a house selling app for that, like Zillow. So, I mean, I'm just asking, is there even a gauge of where that is, just on sheer numbers? I'm asking because, like Dimitri, I feel very singled out. Moved here a few years ago, wanted to start a family, and this young professional, basically. So, like,
yeah,
that
again,
feedback.
Absolutely, and it's something that we're trying to understand, but it's not something that we're able to say with any sort of definitive sense. So, yeah, it's just not a question that we're able to answer definitively.
Thanks, Ari, for that question. All right, Mark, and then we're going to move to Wesley.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Generally, I want to ask a question about those of us that live in the Durham County side of the town of Chapel Hill. I know I've talked to some people individually, but I want to hear it officially from you whether us in that county are included in these plans, because we're part of Chapel Hill City, but living in Durham County and paying Durham County taxes. If you could comment on that. And then secondly, I'd like to know if there's going to be any individual review of changes, like from a single house to a triplex, or cottage housing that you're talking about, or are these projects going to be allowed to go on unreviewed and unmonitored? If someone buys a house, they'll just be able to do whatever they'd like to do because it's zoned for either or is there going to be any kind of individual review of a house that's upzoning from a single house to a triplex or duplex? And then finally, I think that you're underestimating profit making from developers and even individual people. We've been looking for a house. We've been living in the same house in Chapel Hill for 20 plus years on the Durham County side, but housing has become so unaffordable in Chapel Hill, as I'm sure you know, that we've considered taking profit on our current house that we bought 20 years ago and moving elsewhere. But even the houses that we've looked at in Durham and in underserved and underdeveloped areas, there's an awful lot of flipping going on where people are buying houses for 200 grand, putting in a new kitchen and selling it for 485. So this is the kind of thing I think is a very likely outcome of what you're trying to do here, is you're going to end up, instead of having a single family house for 650, you're going to have a triplex that's selling for 650 each. And I think that's going to be something that's just going to make the town less affordable for people. And I know that you're saying that you're not considering affordability, but I think really that's the major problem right now, more than the availability of housing stock. And those are my comments. So if you could just answer on the Durham County question, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, Mark, if you're there's a sliver of Chapel Hill that is in Durham County, and as long as you're within the town's boundaries, this would impact you.
Oh, I'm sorry, in the notification.
Oh, about permitting?
If there's a single house that's up zoning to a duplex or a triplex, will there be any review of that, or is that just going to happen as the owner desires?
So under the current proposal, the requirements for the permitting process would be the same as single family, where it would be coming through the planning department. Planning would be reviewing it to make sure that it complies with the zoning requirements, setbacks, heights, use, all those things. And so much like single family, the proposal is not to do a neighborhood notification like you might receive, for a conditional zoning permit or site plan or one of the other processes that goes through a board. So we're a little over time. We're gonna go to Wesley and then Alexis.
Hey, Anya, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. All right, real quick question. I think it's understood, but just to clarify, I've heard people talking about developers taking a property or the town putting one of these miscellaneous housing options on a property. But doesn't it start with someone selling their house? Like someone on this call or someone in the neighborhood would have to choose to sell their house to whomever they wanted to, and then that person would make the choice. So I feel like some people think that this will somehow allow a developer to take your house or to somehow put something on your property to hurt your space or gardens. Is it true that that's not going to happen? That really you have to sell your property to someone in order for one of these things to be built, and that properties can't be taken or the town can't put things on there?
That's resoundingly true, Wes. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks. Let's do Alexis and then KH, you are going to be our last person tonight.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for being here, everybody. I have a few questions I'll try to get through really quickly and just say I appreciate some high density or higher density. I personally wouldn't like to see fourplexes or larger in Colony Woods, but I can get on board with possibly duplexes or larger ADUs. I think that makes sense, and for them to be in the right format with the right restrictions. But for one thing about the restrictive covenants, I'll just say we were talking about that. That is public record, and I hope if the town council sees this, that they would give you the resources to check those so that we can clearly understand which neighborhoods can be checked. It's a finite number and it's not that hard. I understand that you're saying you might not have those resources, but it's not that difficult to figure that out. I think that would be helpful for everyone. So people know if their homes are going to be affected, if their neighborhoods are going to be affected. And then I think just for the proposal itself, I'd love to know how many units could this possibly add as you're thinking through this. I think that that is ultimately what you're going for. And so if you don't know how many neighborhoods are even affected, how could you possibly know what the sum total added units would be? And how could you compare that to other ways that you can add units, like higher density units in Blue Hill, which I know a lot of people hate, and I don't. I mean, I think that those were the right things in those places, but certainly I wouldn't like to see that, you know, in my backyard in Colony Woods. So hopefully that can be something that you all can provide. I think it would help the residents. And I guess a question, if you added units to areas like this, would there be part of this proposal some kind of earmark for green space or parks, public parks and green space? Is that something that's discussed or in these proposals?
Thanks, Alexis, for those questions and comments. Just your last question, that is not something that's currently included in the proposal, but it's certainly something that we could consider as we continue to refine it.
Okay, and if it is a work in progress, is there a chance that it's going to be modified and not just passed or not passed? Is this truly a work in progress?
Absolutely. We're not going back to the drawing board because we've never left the drawing board. We are very much still working to improve the proposal. Yeah.
Okay, that's it. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, KH, we're gonna let you be have you be the last person to talk tonight.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. This is Kate. Hi, neighbors. Thank you, town planners, for letting us join and speak. My question is really about the approach to the rezoning. So, of course, I'm just a lay person, but even reading articles about missing middle housing, there have been some criticisms of just blanket rezoning as the approach to achieving that. And so when I, like for me, you know, driving along Ephesus Church Road or those other DOT roads, you know, I can see in general where saying things like, oh, the setbacks are going to be the same as single family housing appeases certain fears farther in neighborhoods. But when you think about stretches right along those busy DOT roads, to me, it doesn't make sense that you would have those same setback requirements. And I think confining it to just that pigeonholes developers into very unimaginative use of that green space. And you end up with just like little rectangles of lawn that really aren't that usable. And you actually you build in policies that prevent more imaginative and community-centered use of green space and impermeable space. So can you talk at all to that as to whether it's going to be blanket rezoning and that's it, or whether the town is at all considering thinking carefully about maybe changing some of those setbacks and other things along, again, some of these busy roads so that you can have better use of the green space and so that you're not also undercutting walkability initiatives like bike paths and sidewalks because of the way that exiting from driveways would be happening with that tripling, quadrupling of density.
So I think just very broadly, we can talk about how setbacks usually aren't determined on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. It really follows your underlying zoning. And so the setbacks differ from R1 to R2 to R3. I believe there might be some additional setbacks if you're along a major highway. But one thing that I think you did bring up that was a really good point is thinking very thoughtfully about that green space and the usable open space. Because you're right, if we have folks living in a fourplex, that they should be able to have some outdoor amenity space. And I flagged that, I made a note of it. So thank you for that. Okay, so with that, I think we made it through almost everybody. We will commit to, again, we'll send out an email to all of you so that you have the links to the frequently asked questions, the project website that has the calendar dates of the upcoming meetings, as well as the public input page. They were also in the chat if anybody needs them. Taz, I don't know if you have any last words.
No, I would just say thank you. This is exactly the sort of conversation we were hoping to have. We need and want to hear your questions and concerns. And so thank you all for showing up. I think at most we had close to 80 people on the call. And that's amazing. We enjoy hearing from the community. And so thank you all very much for joining us tonight.
All right. Thank you again, guys. We'll see you later, and just watch for that email from us.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.